My name is Evadne Whitmore, and at 70 years old I thought I had already endured the worst a family could inflict: distance, silence, small cruelty swept under the rug. I have lived long enough to lose friends, bury a husband, and rebuild myself in the quiet hours of my Charleston home. I believed I had grown impervious, but that morning the illusion cracked as easily as porcelain. I was sitting at the kitchen counter, tea cooling beside me, when a notification lit my phone. A tag from a distant cousin I hadn't spoken to in years. Curious, I tapped it open, and there they were, rows of smiling faces, glasses, raised tables draped in soft linen. A bridal shower carefully staged in pastel colors. My son's fiancée, Lena, glowed at the center, surrounded by 30 women, some of whom I didn't even recognize. I scrolled through the gallery slowly, each image striking harder than the one before. Aunts, cousins, even family friends who used to send me Christmas cards. Every seat at every table was filled. Every hand held a flute of champagne. My hand jerked, and the mug slipped from my grasp. It hit the tile with a hollow crack and shattered into white fragments that scattered across the floor. I stared at them, my pulse hammering in my ears. A part of me wanted to believe my invitation had been lost in the mail, that some mistake had been made, but I knew better. The truth arrived with the echo of a sentence I had tried for months to forget. Lena's voice clipped and cold. "She'll ruin my day." I remember standing in her kitchen last winter, holding a plate of cookies I had baked, offering to help with planning. Her smile had been brittle, her eyes sharp. Those words had been a warning one my son hadn't challenged. I told myself it was a moment of stress, a bride overwhelmed. Yet here it was, laid bare on my phone screen. Her warning had turned into action. I had not been overlooked. I had been deliberately erased. I bent to gather the shards of my mug, hands trembling, and set them gently in the trash. The kitchen was silent, but for the sound of my own breathing. My phone still glowed on the counter, the images waiting. I wiped my hands on my apron and pressed my thumb against my son's name in the contact list. The line began to ring. The ringing pulsed in my ear, each chime sharp as glass. I thought of the broken mug at my feet, swept into the trash and almost hung up. Then the line clicked, and a voice I didn't expect spilled through. "Hello, Lena." For a moment I was caught between courtesy and fury. I was calling for Nathan. I managed my voice steadier than I felt. "He's here." I could hear voices in the background, laughter, the clatter of dishes. A house alive with company. But I'll answer Evadne. "What's wrong?" I hadn't given her permission to call me by my first name, not like that casual dismissive. I swallowed. "I saw the photos this morning." Everyone was there. I wasn't. Silence stretched, but only for a heartbeat. Then Lena's tone turned brisk, efficient, like cutting through a knot with a knife. "We thought it would be better this way. Less complicated." Complicated. The word tasted bitter. "Yes." She didn't hesitate. "Nathan and I agreed. You have strong feelings. You get emotional. And the day is supposed to be about us, about joy. No distractions." I tightened my grip on the phone, knuckles whitening. "I'm his mother," I said softly. "That's not a distraction. That's a fact." From the other end, I caught a faint sound. Nathan's voice, muffled, saying something I couldn't make out. I held my breath, waiting for him to step forward to take the phone, to contradict his fiancée. But his voice faded. He didn't come. Lena filled the space. "Look, Evadne, please don't take this personally. It's just easier without the drama. You know how family can get." My throat closed around the words rising inside me. For years, I'd taught children how to shape language on paper, how to make each line sing. Now, faced with my own son's silence and the sharpness of his bride-to-be, I found myself voiceless. Does Nathan know you're saying this to me? I finally asked. A pause. I imagined her eyes flicking toward him, daring him to intervene. Then, of course he knows. We're on the same page. I waited again for his voice, for any sign that he disagreed, that he still remembered who held him through fevers, who saved coins in jars to send him to summer programs, who kept his drawings in a shoebox, even after he stopped making them. The background laughter swelled, someone calling for champagne. His silence pressed heavier than any words. I closed my eyes, and for a second, I was back in the classroom, watching a child erase and erase until the paper tore. That was what this felt like. Someone had taken an eraser to me, rubbing, until I was only a faint shadow on the page. Thank you for letting me know, I said finally. My voice was calm, though my hands trembled. Good, Lena replied, as if we had settled something simple, a date on a calendar. It's better for everyone. We'll keep you updated about the wedding. The words landed like cold stones. Updated, as though I were an acquaintance, a distant relative on the edge of obligation. I ended the call before she could add anything more. The kitchen was still bright with late morning light, but it felt dim inside me. I set the phone down carefully, afraid of dropping it the way I had dropped the mug, as if everything fragile in my life might break today. The laughter from their house still echoed faintly in my mind as I stood alone in mine. The house was quiet after that phone call, but my body buzzed as though I'd been standing too close to a storm. I moved from room to room, picking things up and setting them down without purpose. An old vase on the shelf, a folded quilt at the end of my bed. Anything to anchor me. My son's silence clung heavier than Lena's words, and I kept replaying it, searching for something I might have missed. Late that afternoon, my phone lit again. A message blinked across the screen, part of a thread I didn't recognize. It took a second for me to realize I had been added by mistake, or maybe someone had tapped the wrong name. Remember to bring the extra flowers Saturday. Fiona's allergic to lilies. Yes, got it. And thank goodness we didn't invite Evaden. Less drama to manage. The name sat there in black and white. Evaden, my name. My absence transformed into a punchline. I read it 3 times, the words blurring at the edges, until instinct kicked in. I took a screenshot, then another, afraid the evidence might vanish. A moment later, the message disappeared, deleted by the sender, the little notification sliding across the screen with cruel finality. But the proof was safe in my gallery now, pixel by pixel. Time-stamped. For a long time, I just stood there staring at the quiet walls of my living room. The weight of it settled not in my chest, but in my bones. They hadn't forgotten me. They hadn't overlooked me. They had planned it together and laughed about it after. I sat down heavily on the sofa, hands pressed against my knees, and memories began to creep in, uninvited. Small slights, 100 paper cuts I had chosen not to name. Thanksgiving tables where Lena's jokes were met with applause, while mine were met with silence. Birthdays, where Nathan's wife gave me practical gifts, dish towels, hand lotion, while I handed them framed sketches, hours of my time. Even the first time she visited my house, glancing at my worn drapes with a smile too sharp to be kind. I had swallowed those moments, telling myself family wasn't perfect, that peace mattered more than pride. But now, looking at the screenshot glowing in my hand, I felt a chill. Peace built on erasure isn't peace at all. I rose and walked to the bookshelf where an old leather-bound journal sat tucked between novels. I hadn't written in it for years. Its pages smelled faintly of cedar and thyme. Sitting at the kitchen table, I opened it and began to write, not just about the group text, but every memory that had stung and been left to fade. My pen scratched steadily across the paper, the year Nathan graduated, and Lena's parents sat in the front row while I was asked to take photos from the aisle. The Christmas when Lena insisted we change the dinner hour to suit her family, leaving me alone at my own table until near midnight. The look on Nathan's face each time he avoided choosing between us. By the time I set the pen down, several pages were filled. The journal lay open like a record, my handwriting slanting sharp, my pulse steady for the first time all day. I wasn't inventing anything. I wasn't being dramatic. It was there, written, traced, undeniable. I smoothed the page with the flat of my hand. Outside, the Charleston evening turned the windows gold, the air thick with the scent of gardenias from the neighbor's yard. I breathed it in, the sweetness clashing with the acid of betrayal. On my phone, the screenshot glowed again, waiting. Proof that I wasn't imagining this. Proof that I mattered enough to be mocked, if not respected. I closed the journal and set it beside the phone, side by side on the table. The shadows deepened, and I realized I had begun something I could not easily stop. I closed the leather journal and let my fingers rest on its worn cover. The weight of memories pressing harder than ink. Writing them down hadn't dulled them. It had sharpened them, brought them into focus. I found myself drifting back, unspooling years of dinners and celebrations where my place at the table had always felt fragile, conditional. The sharpest memory returned in colors of autumn Thanksgiving 2 years ago. My sister's house smelled of roasted turkey and cloves, the air so thick with chatter that every word seemed to cling. Nathan and Lena had arrived late, as they often did. Lena sweeping into the dining room with her hair styled in perfect waves, a bottle of wine balanced elegantly in her hand. A promotion my cousin Clara announced as the family gathered, lifting her glass toward Lena. Vice President at 29. Can you imagine? The room erupted in applause. Even the children clapped their small hands against the table. I smiled politely, but the noise pressed at my ears, a tide I couldn't swim against. When the conversation lulled, I cleared my throat, almost shy. I've finally closed on my condo, I said. It took me 7 years of saving every teaching check, but I put down $150,000. No mortgage to worry about now. It should have been something to celebrate security, earned late in life independence, carved out with discipline. But the room shifted uncomfortably. My announcement landed like a pebble tossed into a roaring fire, swallowed whole before it could spark. That's nice, Evadne, my sister murmured, her smile already drifting back toward Lena. Someone asked about the engagement ring, and just like that, my story evaporated. The ring was passed around, reverently admired under the warm light of the chandelier, each sparkle mirrored in the family's eyes. I sat with my hands folded in my lap, my glass of cider untouched, listening as Nathan described the proposal. Every detail choreographed, every laugh timed. The pride in his voice pierced me, not because he was happy, but because the same warmth never reached me. Later, when dessert was served, I caught my reflection in the darkened window above the buffet. I was there but fading, half hidden by candlelight, surrounded by laughter that did not need me. I had contributed pies, side dishes, even flowers from my garden. Yet somehow my presence had become background. It wasn't only that night. There were dozens of others like it. The Christmas when my hand-sewn stockings were set aside for store-bought decorations Lena had chosen. The 4th of July when my potato salad sat untouched because Nathan prefers Lena's recipe. Even birthdays my own, where gifts were an afterthought hurriedly chosen, while others' milestones were celebrated with toasts and speeches. Each memory stitched itself into a pattern, a tapestry I had refused to look at until now. Taken alone, each slight was small enough to dismiss, but together they formed a wall, and behind it, I was disappearing. The journal lay open again, my handwriting looping across the pages. I added a note in the margin, simple and steady, $150,000 savings ignored. Engagement rings celebrated. It looked stark, factual, undeniable. The clock ticked in the quiet Charleston's evening hum slipping through my open window, distant traffic, the faint whistle of a train. I had lived my life believing patience was virtue, that dignity meant swallowing hurts. But as I set down the pen, I wondered if patience had only taught them to overlook me. The shadows stretched longer across the kitchen floor. The air carried the faint scent of gardenia and the salt of the nearby marshes. I leaned back in my chair, my eyes on the ceiling, and let the silence settle deep. Exclusion didn't start with an unreceived invitation. It started years ago at tables where my voice went unheard, and now the silence had become complete. By Friday, the walls of my condo felt too close, the journal too heavy, with inked hurts. I couldn't stand the silence of it any longer. I needed to hear my son's voice, not through muffled laughter in the background of a call, not filtered through Lena's clipped sentences, but face to face. So I drove across town over the Ashley River Bridge, the marshland stretching out on either side, herons lifting into the blue. Nathan's neighborhood was new, full of trimmed lawns and houses, painted in variations of beige. His porch had a wreath too perfect to be handmade, its silk ribbon unbothered by wind. I climbed the steps, heart hammering, and knocked. It was Nathan who answered. My son, taller than I, remembered his hair thinning at the temples, his smile hesitant. For a second, I almost turned back, almost swallowed it again. But the memory of that screenshot glowed in my mind like a brand. "Mom," he said, surprised but not displeased. "Come in." Inside the house smelled faintly of cinnamon. A candle burned on the counter, staged for comfort. I noticed the absence of Lena, though her presence lingered in every curated detail, the spotless counters, the bowls arranged just so. Nathan gestured to the sofa. "I won't take much of your time," I said, though my hands gripped the strap of my purse like a lifeline. "I need to understand. Why wasn't I invited?" Nathan sat down across from me, his elbows on his knees. He rubbed his palms together, a nervous habit from childhood he'd never shaken. "Mom, Lena feels you can be too emotional, sometimes controlling. She thought it might overshadow things." The words landed with a dull weight. I kept my voice low. Overshadow things. By existing. His gaze flicked up, guilt swimming in his eyes, then away again. "She just wants the day to go smoothly. No complications. You know how she is about appearances." "And you?" I pressed. "Do you agree?" Silence stretched between us. He didn't answer. Not directly. Instead, his voice softened, pleading. "Please, don't make this harder than it already is. Just let it go for me." There it was, the truth, sharper than any insult. He wasn't protecting Lena from me. He was protecting himself from conflict. My son, the boy I raised through scraped knees and late-night fevers, now a man who chose the path of least resistance, even if it meant stepping over me. I looked at him. Really looked at the lines forming around his eyes, the weariness already etched into someone too young to be so tired. He still loved me. I could feel it in the way his voice faltered, but it was the kind of love that bent to keep peace with his wife, not the kind that stood tall beside his mother. I loosened my grip on the purse strap and let my hands rest in my lap. "You're asking me to erase myself so she won't be uncomfortable." Nathan flinched just barely. "I'm asking you not to fight." The room felt colder than when I'd walked in. The candle on the counter flickered in a draft, throwing shadows across the walls. I thought of every sacrifice that had brought him here. Lessons prepared after midnight, clothes mended, the 7 years I worked without pause to save for his college tuition. All of it now outweighed by the need to keep peace in this immaculate house. I stood slowly. "I won't fight Nathan," I said, "but I also won't disappear." His mouth opened, then closed again. Words trapped behind fear or loyalty, I couldn't tell which. He didn't move to stop me as I walked to the door. The wreath brushed against my arm as I stepped back into the sunlight. The air outside was warm, but inside me, something had chilled to stone. The weekend passed in a haze, my son's words replaying with every tick of the clock. By Monday, I tried to ground myself in work, the one place where I still believed my value was clear. My small design business had grown steady over the past decade. Wedding invitations, programs, menus, calligraphy on heavy cardstock. Brides came to me for hand-pressed detail they couldn't find in glossy catalogs. I set out samples on the dining table that morning, brushing my fingers over embossed paper, willing the rhythm of routine to settle me. But my phone buzzed with a new message. A cousin, one I hadn't spoken to in months, sent a single line. "Maybe you should just let Fiona have her moment. People are saying you're jealous." I stared at the screen, the words twisting in my gut. Another message arrived minutes later, this time from an aunt in Savannah. "We love you, but your behavior has folks concerned. You don't want to look unstable, do you? Unstable." The word seemed to bloom in the quiet room, filling every corner. I thought of my journal, the careful notes I had written down, and wondered if they would now be read not as proof, but as evidence of obsession. By noon, I had an email from one of my clients, a polite withdrawal wrapped in professional phrasing. "We've decided to go in a different direction for our wedding stationery. Thank you for your time." I blinked at the screen, my throat tightening. They had already approved the proofs. I had already ordered materials. I sent back a calm reply, asking if something had changed. The answer came quickly. "We've heard you can be difficult to work with. We just need someone who's easygoing." The words burned. Difficult to work with. I whispered it aloud as if hearing it would soften the blow. But it didn't. 2 days later, another couple canceled. This one I knew more personally. The bride's mother played bridge with Aunt Marlene. Their email was shorter, sharper. "We think it's best to avoid unnecessary complications. Thank you for understanding." Complications. Unstable. Jealous. The vocabulary of exile. I opened my accounting folder that evening and ran the numbers. 2 lost contracts meant nearly $5,000 in revenue gone just like that. For someone else, it might have been a dent. For me, it was months of groceries, utilities, the cushion that kept me independent. I pressed my forehead against the cool edge of the table. I had worked too long and too hard to lose everything to whispers. Yet the whispers were already circling, carried by bloodlines that were supposed to protect me. The next morning, I walked to the small market on King Street, determined to escape my 4 walls. As I reached for a basket, I heard a pair of voices behind me. 2 women, both familiar. I recognized one as Caroline, a longtime friend of my mother. "So dramatic," one said. "Can you imagine making a scene at your own son's wedding events? I heard she was furious she wasn't invited," the other replied. "It's embarrassing at her age." Unstable, really. My hand tightened on the basket handle. They hadn't noticed me yet. I considered turning, confronting them, demanding they repeat it to my face. But my voice caught, and I found myself setting the basket down gently and walking back out into the sunlight. Charleston's air was heavy with humidity, magnolia blossoms drooping over iron gates. I walked slowly, each step weighed down by the truth the family's judgment was no longer contained at their table. It was seeping into the streets. I walked the work I had built, the reputation I had nurtured for decades. By the time I reached home, I had made myself a promise. I would not beg to correct their story, but I would not let it erase me either. The journal waited on the table, open to a blank page. I picked up my pen and began to write again. By Wednesday evening, I hadn't answered the phone all day. Every ring, every ping felt like another hand tugging me underwater. I left my journal open on the table, pages covered in tight loops of handwriting, and sat staring at the ceiling fan, turning slowly above me. The air in my condo felt thick as though betrayal itself had weight. A knock startled me. 3 firm raps, then a familiar voice through the door. Evadne. It's me. Open up. I pulled myself up and cracked the door. Isla stood there balancing a paper bag fragrant with lemongrass and chili. Her black hair was pulled into a bun camera bag slung across her shoulder, as always. Her eyes searched mine, and she stepped inside, without waiting for permission, the way only an old friend could. I brought Thai, she announced, setting the bag on the counter. And wine. You look like you need both. The smell stirred something in me. Warmth, hunger I hadn't realized I'd been ignoring. We sat at the table, containers spread between us, steam curling upward. I picked at noodles while Isla poured wine into mismatched glasses. She waited until I'd eaten a few bites before speaking. I've been hearing things, she said gently. And not from you. From people who think I don't know better. They're saying you're unstable jealous, that you make everything about yourself. I pressed my lips together, shame prickling, even though I'd done nothing wrong. That Isla said firmly. Chopsticks tapping the air is textbook gaslighting. They exclude you. Then tell everyone you'd be trouble if you came. It's not the truth, it's a narrative. And they're feeding it to anyone who'll listen. The word gaslighting sat in the air, like a match struck in the dark. Something about hearing it aloud steadied me. So, I'm not imagining it. Her gaze softened. You're not dramatic, Evadne. You're being erased. There's a difference. The words landed with a kind of mercy I hadn't known I needed. I set my fork down and rubbed at my eyes. They've already cost me clients. People whisper in grocery stores. I don't know how to fight shadows. You don't, Isla replied. You step into the light instead. You don't let them define the story. We ate in silence for a while, the only sound the rustle of containers, the hum of the refrigerator. When I finally looked at her again, she was watching me with that photographer's gaze of hers, sharp, unflinching, searching for the truth beneath the surface. Come away with me, she said suddenly. I blinked. What? This weekend? I've got a shoot down at Folly Beach. Nothing big, just an engagement session. Stay in the rental with me, walk by the ocean, breathe. You need distance, fresh air, a horizon that isn't lined with your family's shadows. I laughed, but it broke halfway. I can't just run away. You wouldn't be running, Isla said softly. You'd be choosing yourself. There's a difference. The condo was quiet around us, the journal still open to half-written sentences. I thought of the phone calls, the cancellations, Nathan's eyes avoiding mine. The weight of it all pressed down, but the idea of salt air, of waves pulling and releasing against the sand, tugged at something deep inside. Folly Beach, I murmured. Folly Beach, she echoed, smiling. One weekend. Just you, me, and the ocean. Say yes. I reached for my glass of wine, the ruby surface catching the light. My hands no longer trembled. For the first time in days, I felt a window crack open, letting in air that wasn't thick with judgment. By Saturday morning, Isla had me packed into her car with a duffel bag and a cooler full of sandwiches. Charleston slipped away behind us, the salt marshes widening as we crossed toward Folly. The road narrowed, live oaks draping their branches overhead, and then suddenly, the ocean opened out, endless and steady waves rolling like a heartbeat. The rental cottage was small and a little weathered, perched close enough to the sand that the porch smelled of brine. I carried my bag upstairs and opened the window wide. The air rushed in sharp, salt-stung alive. For the first time in weeks, I filled my lungs without feeling as though the air itself was weighted. That afternoon, Isla left for her engagement shoot camera, swinging from her shoulder, promising to be back before dinner. I wandered into the town center, drawn by the hum of beach shops and the clink of cafe cups. The place was crowded with sunburned families, college kids on bicycles, and couples walking barefoot, sandals dangling from their hands. I found myself pausing outside a narrow shop tucked between a surf rental place and an ice cream stand. The sign read, "Duarte's Books and Brew." The scent of coffee pulled me in. Inside, the air was cooler, lined with shelves of used novels and poetry anthologies, a counter stacked with pastries under glass. Behind it stood a man in his early 50s with silver threaded through his dark hair and a slow smile that seemed to warm the whole space. He greeted me with a nod as I ordered tea, his voice low and even touched with the faint trace of an accent. I settled at a corner table near the window, pulling my sketchbook from my bag. I hadn't touched it in weeks, not since the first whispers had started. But the rhythm of the sea outside coaxed my hand, and soon I was sketching the curve of a pelican, mid-dive the broken shell of a sand dollar I'd picked up earlier. When the man came to clear the next table, he paused at mine. "That's beautiful," he said, nodding toward the page. I closed the book, halfway embarrassed. Just lines and shapes. Nothing finished. Lines and shapes that see what most people miss. He replied, "I'm Matteo." I introduced myself. My voice awkward, but his smile steadied me. He asked if I lived in Foli, and when I told him I was visiting, his eyes softened with understanding. "Sometimes we come to the sea when we need to breathe again." His words pierced gently like a truth spoken without prying. I sipped my tea and let him talk about his shop, how he'd restored it from an old bait store, how he kept both books and coffee because stories need warmth. I listened, sketching, absently surprised at how easy it felt to sit across from someone who didn't weigh me down with judgment. When I left, he pressed a small bookmark into my hand, embossed with a watercolor of the shoreline. "To keep your place," he said simply. Walking back to the cottage, I traced the edges of the bookmark. The ocean roared steady behind me, waves rising and breaking, then beginning again. I thought of my son's silence, Lena's clipped words, the rumors that bled into my work. All of it shrank a little against the vast horizon. For once, I didn't feel erased. I felt seen, even in the quiet lines of a sketchbook and the glance of a stranger who noticed. The next morning, I walked the shoreline alone while Isla slept off her late-night editing session. The tide had pulled low, leaving ribbons of shells along the sand, each one fractured yet gleaming. I bent to pick up a piece of sea glass, its edges smoothed by time and salt. It caught the morning light, a small reminder that even broken things could become something beautiful. When I returned to Duarte's Books and Brew for tea, Matteo was arranging a display of novels in the window. He looked up and smiled as though he had been expecting me. "You found the sea glass," he said, noticing it in my palm. "I used to collect those when I restored the villa north of here. Every shard felt like a secret the ocean had been keeping." "The villa?" I asked. He told me about it as he poured hot water into my cup. Years ago, he had stumbled on a crumbling seaside house, shutters, falling roof, half rotted. People told him to tear it down, start fresh. Instead, he had spent years sanding beams, replacing tiles, coaxing it back into life. He called it a place for light, and the way he said it, I believed him. As he spoke, something stirred inside me, something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in weeks. Possibility. I opened my sketchbook, the pencil trembling a little in my hand, and began to draw. Not shells this time, not birds. A table on a bluff facing the sea. 18 chairs, no more. Lanterns swaying in the breeze. Plates I could design myself, botanical borders, hand-lettered menus. Matteo leaned closer, watching the lines take shape. "It looks like a ceremony." I hesitated, then nodded. "Not a wedding exactly. More like a gathering. A celebration of being alive, of still having a voice." He didn't laugh, didn't tilt his head in pity. He only said, "That sounds like a story worth telling." Back at the cottage, Isla found me bent over the sketchbook pages, spreading across the table like a map. She peered over my shoulder, her eyes lighting. "This is yours," she whispered. "Not theirs. Yours." "It isn't about competing with them," I said quickly, though part of me still feared it might look that way. "It's not revenge. It's creation." Isla finished. "You're building something that can't be taken from you." The word settled into me like a stone in a riverbed, steady and sure. Creation. I drew deep into the afternoon until my hand cramped and my tea went cold. By the time the sun dropped low, I had filled half the journal with details. Wildflowers in amber and sage tables, draped in linen, but unpolished, the ocean itself as the backdrop. 18 guests, each one chosen for love, not obligation. I thought of the family table where my words had gone unheard, of the ring that was passed around while my savings were ignored. These sketches. This idea was not another attempt to beg for a seat. It was a table of my own, making set in the open air, where no one could pretend I wasn't there. When Isla came back from a walk, I held the book open for her to see. She traced a finger along the lines of lanterns swinging above the tables. "I'll photograph it," she said softly. "Not as a job, as a gift." I felt a warmth spread in my chest that no rumor could smother. For the first time in months, I wasn't defending myself. I wasn't collecting proof of cruelty. I was imagining something new, and in that imagining, I felt free. The sea roared outside, tireless and unashamed. My pencil hovered over the page one last time, and I wrote in the margin, "Not reaction. Creation." Back in Charleston, the days seemed lighter with the sketchbook full of seaside plans. I moved through my condo with a new steadiness, as though the salt air had rinsed something from my lungs. I worked on sample menus, sorted through swatches of linen, and even hummed while brewing tea. For the first time in weeks, I felt anticipation instead of dread. It was late on a Tuesday when my phone lit with Lena's name. The message was short, almost abrupt. "Wedding date has changed. Grand Monarch Hotel booked us earlier, May 15th. Just letting you know." I stared at the glowing screen, my breath caught in my throat. May 15th, the exact weekend Isla and I had circled for my seaside gathering. My pencil slipped from my fingers and rolled across the table. The phone rang before I could think. I pressed accept, my voice caught in the pause. "You saw the message?" Lena asked, her tone clipped. "Yes, it'll be better this way. We secured the hotel. Everyone has been told." "Everyone," I repeated slowly. "Except me." She ignored the edge in my voice. "Look, Evadin, I also heard something about your little beach event. It's awkward, don't you think? Same weekend. People will feel divided. It makes us look bad." The word "us" pressed sharp, as though I were a stranger, trespassing on her marriage, her family. "You should cancel." She went on, her voice brisk, decisive. "It isn't fair to put people in that position. They'll feel forced to choose. Do the right thing." I leaned back in my chair, my fingers resting on the sketchbook, still open on the table. Lanterns, wildflowers, waves drawn in pencil lines that had carried me through sleepless nights. My throat felt dry, but my voice came steady. "I won't rearrange my joy to fit your judgment." Silence hummed on the line, long enough for me to hear the faint click of her breath. "Excuse me," she asked, the sharpness cutting deeper now. "You heard me?" I said, my voice quiet but firm. "This isn't about competing with you, Lena. It's about reclaiming space I was told I didn't deserve. I've made my plans. They will go on." Her tone cooled, brittle as ice. "If you insist on this, don't expect anyone to come. People know where they belong." The line clicked dead before I could answer. The condo fell into stillness again, but it was no longer oppressive. I closed the sketchbook gently, brushing my hand across the page as though sealing the promise. That evening, I called Isla, my voice firmer than I felt. She listened quietly as I explained, then laughed not with mockery, but with something fierce. "Let them flinch," she said. "We'll build it anyway. Light doesn't need permission to shine." After the call, I stood at the balcony, the city humming beneath me, the scent of gardenias drifting up from the street. I thought of Nathan, his silence, his eyes darting away. I thought of Lena's words, that brittle demand. And I thought of the sea, steady and relentless waves breaking, no matter who tried to command them. The choice had been made. Their date, my date, two tides colliding. But for the first time, I didn't feel afraid of the undertow. I whispered the words again into the night air, as if they were a vow. "I won't rearrange my joy to fit your judgment." The morning after Lena's call, I woke with the uneasy weight of her words still pressing on my chest. Yet when I looked at the sketches scattered across my dining table, I didn't feel defeated. I felt protective, as though these plans were seedlings pushing through hard soil. If I tended them, they might still bloom. That afternoon, Isla appeared at my door again, camera bag on one shoulder, a stack of glossy magazines under her arm. She barely waited for me to invite her in before spreading the magazines out across the table. "You don't need to hire anyone for photos," she declared. "I'll do it. As a gift. No arguments." I started to protest, but she silenced me with a look. "Evadne, you've spent your life giving your time, your care, your art. Let someone give back." The words stilled me. I knotted my throat too tight for thanks. Later that week, I stopped by Duarte's Books and Brew. Mateo was behind the counter, sleeves rolled up, reading glasses perched low on his nose as he checked receipts. I mentioned my seaside gathering almost hesitantly, expecting polite interest at most. Instead, his whole face lit. "How many guests?" 18, I said. "No more. It needs to stay small." "Then you need spreadsheets," he replied matter-of-factly. He pulled out his laptop, right there at the counter, sliding his coffee aside. "Accommodations, food, flowers, chairs? You need columns. Logistics are where dreams die if you don't prepare." I laughed, a sound I hadn't heard from myself in months. "You're volunteering?" "Of course. Let me handle the order of things so you can handle the beauty of them." When I left that afternoon, he had already drafted a schedule and emailed me lists of local vendors. I walked back through the Folly streets lighter, as if the ocean air itself had conspired to help me carry this dream. The help didn't stop there. Word spread quietly, not through family, but through friends, former students who remembered my classroom. One evening, I opened my email to find a note from Clara, a young woman I'd taught calligraphy to years ago. "Mrs. Whitmore, I heard about your gathering," it read. "Let me contribute the flowers. My shop can cover the arrangements. Consider it repayment for the encouragement you gave me when I didn't believe in myself." I pressed a hand to my mouth, blinking back tears. The next day, another message arrived from a neighbor who offered to bake bread from a retired colleague who promised to loan extra tables. Piece by piece, my gathering was being stitched together, not by obligation, not by blood, but by love freely given. One evening, as the sun slipped low, I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by samples, fabrics, sketches, Mateo's spreadsheets, Isla's photographs clipped to inspiration boards. My journal lay open, no longer filled only with slights and shadows, but with notes about centerpieces, playlists, and guest lists that actually made me smile. I realized then that I wasn't doing this alone. Even in the absence of the people I had expected to stand beside me, others had stepped forward, friends, students, neighbors. They didn't ask what it would look like to others. They didn't weigh appearances against acceptance. They simply showed up. For the first time in months, I no longer felt erased. I felt surrounded. The sea glass sat on my windowsill, glowing in the last light of day. I touched it lightly and whispered to myself, "This is the family that counts. The invitations for my seaside gathering were never printed. Instead, I had written simple notes on heavy cardstock, each one lettered by hand. It felt truer that way. Personal, deliberate. I mailed them quietly, choosing only those who had shown me kindness. For days after I heard nothing from the family I had grown up with. Their silence was a wall I no longer tried to scale. Then one evening my phone rang. The name on the screen startled me, Rachel, my cousin from Atlanta. We hadn't spoken in years beyond the occasional holiday text. I hesitated, thumb hovering, before answering. Aunt Evadne. Her voice was softer than I remembered, tentative. I hope I'm not calling too late? No, not at all, I said, settling into the chair by the window. What's on your mind? She exhaled the kind of breath people take before stepping onto shaky ground. I'm confused. I've heard 3 different versions of why you're not at Nathan's wedding. Aunt Marlene said you refused the invitation out of pride. Your mother's sister told me you weren't feeling well enough to travel. And then Fiona told one of my cousins you caused too much drama to be included. Which is it? The words tumbled into me like stones rolling down a hill, not sharp anymore, but heavy. For the first time, someone else had noticed the cracks. I was never invited, I said simply. That's the truth. Silence. Then Rachel's quiet. I thought so. We talked for a few more minutes, circling polite phrases, but the weight in her voice told me enough she no longer believed the story being spun. When the call ended, I sat in the stillness, the magnolia trees outside whispering against the windows, and let myself breathe. 2 days later, another call came. This one from Uncle David in Greenville, my father's younger brother. He was not a man who wasted words. Evadne. He began, his voice steady. I need to ask you something. Marlene keeps saying you made a scene, that you turned down the invitation. But I saw a copy of the guest list, and your name isn't on it. Why would she lie? I told him everything, the screenshot, the phone call with Lena, the silence from Nathan. I expected him to argue, to defend. Instead, he grunted softly. I thought as much. Marlene's been weaving stories. They don't line up. For a moment, I didn't know whether to feel vindicated or heartsick. The family had always moved in one chorus, voices harmonized to protect appearances. To hear that chorus faltering felt strange, unsettling. David went on, his tone sharper now. I don't like being manipulated. If they lied about this, what else are they twisting? After we hung up, I stayed at the window long after dusk, the city lights winking awake across Charleston. For the first time, the story of my exclusion was no longer airtight. The neat little narrative Lena and Marlene had built, that I was unstable, jealous, dramatic, was fraying at the edges. I thought of Rachel, hesitating but willing to call, and of David, blunt in his demand for truth. A small shift, but a real one. The wall wasn't solid after all. Cracks had begun to show, and through them the light of something more honest flickered. I closed my journal and set it aside that night. For once, I didn't need to write proof of what had been done to me. The proof was beginning to speak on its own. The knock came just after 8 on a Tuesday morning. I had been sorting through swatches of linen, deciding between amber and sage, when the sound jolted me upright. Through the peephole, I saw 3 figures. Nathan stiff in a pressed shirt, though it was still early. Lena, arms folded tightly across her chest. And Marlene, my sister, carrying her handbag like a gavel. I opened the door slowly. Come in, I said, though my chest tightened. They entered without hesitation. Lena and Marlene took the sofa, their bodies angled together. Nathan remained standing, his hands restless in his pockets. The air smelled faintly of my morning tea cooling on the table, but their presence made it sharp metallic. We thought it best to talk face to face. Marlene began smoothing her skirt. This situation has gone far enough. What situation? I asked quietly. Lena leaned forward, her tone brisk. Your seaside gathering. It's confusing people. They don't know which event to prioritize. It divides the family. And frankly, it looks petty. Nathan cleared his throat, his voice soft. Mom, maybe if you let it go, things would be simpler. My hands trembled slightly, but I pressed them flat on the table. What exactly are you proposing? Marlene glanced at Lena, then spoke with the calm of someone convinced she was reasonable. If you cancel your little event, we'll make sure you're included at the reception. You'll have a seat at the table in the evening. Everyone will see you there, part of the celebration. Isn't that what you want? The word little stung more than I let show. I reached behind me and lifted the leather portfolio that had been waiting on the counter. I laid it on the table and opened it slowly, page by page. Watercolor sketches of lanterns swaying above tables. Hand-lettered menus with botanical borders. Swatches of linen samples of pressed flowers. Photographs Isla had taken of test arrangements, glowing in soft light. They watched silent as I turned each page. This isn't about you. I said, my voice even. It isn't about competing with your hotel banquet or proving myself against your opinions. It's about me living truthfully. For once. Without being erased. Nathan shifted, his mouth tightening. Lena's jaw clenched, but she said nothing. Marlene scoffed lightly, as though dismissing a child's drawing. You'll embarrass yourself with this side project. I met her eyes. Embarrassment is standing in the shadows of my own family, pretending their silence doesn't wound me. Embarrassment is begging for a seat I was never offered. This I touched the page, tracing the inked outline of wildflowers, is not embarrassment. This is mine. The room seemed to pulse with their silence. Nathan finally spoke, his voice raw. Mom, please, don't make this harder than it already is. I closed the portfolio gently, the sound of the clasp snapping shut, echoing louder than his words. I'm not making it harder, Nathan. I'm making it honest. And honesty always feels harder to those who've lived on appearances. Lena stood abruptly, tugging at her purse strap. Then don't expect us at your gathering. I didn't, I replied. Marlene muttered something under her breath, a blend of pity and scorn, before following Lena out. Nathan lingered by the door, his hand on the knob. For a moment, I thought he might turn back, but his shoulders sagged instead. He opened the door and stepped into the hall, leaving me with the scent of my cooling tea and the echo of choices made. I sat back at the table, my fingers still resting on the closed portfolio. Outside, the city stirred awake traffic, humming birds scattering across the morning sky. I drew the leather book closer like a shield and whispered to myself, this isn't about them. It never was. The morning of my gathering dawned with skies so clear they seemed freshly washed. I arrived at the villa just after sunrise, the ocean glinting silver beyond the dunes. Mateo had already been there for hours, his sleeves rolled up as he helped string lanterns between weathered beams of driftwood. Isla flitted from corner to corner, checking light, arranging her lenses. Inside, the long table had been set with linen cloths the color of sand. At each place rested a menu I had lettered myself. The ink, a deep green borders of pressed wildflowers framing every word. A faint scent of salt and sage drifted from the arrangements Clara's shop had delivered, their blossoms loose and natural, as though they'd been gathered from the shore that morning. By late afternoon, the guests began to arrive. Not relatives bound by duty, but people who had chosen to come, former students, neighbors, colleagues, friends who had carried me through griefs small and large. Each greeting felt steady, unforced, as if their presence was not performance, but genuine warmth. I watched as they found their seats, as laughter rose softly into the sea air, and I felt my throat tighten with something like awe. There were no rows of cameras flashing, no orchestrated toasts to remind me where I did or did not belong. Only 18 chairs filled by people who saw me as whole. When the sun began its descent, Mateo lit the lanterns one by one, their glow turning the evening golden. I stood at the head of the table, my palms pressed lightly against the linen. The sea roared behind us, steady and endless. For a long moment, I simply breathed it in the sight of faces turned toward me, not in judgment, but in welcome. I spent years trying to fit myself into places where I was not wanted. I began my voice carrying just enough to be heard above the surf. I tried to earn a seat at tables where silence was my only answer. Tonight, this table is different. It is not about obligation or appearances. It is about respect. And respect I let my hand rest on the menu before me is the rent for a place at my table. No one applauded. They didn't need to. The words settled into the air, into the lantern light, into the waves themselves. I saw Isla lower her camera for a moment, her eyes shining. Mateo, leaning against the beam, gave a small nod as if sealing the vow with me. Dinner flowed easily after that. Bread-broken wine poured conversations weaving in and out like the tide. I found myself laughing, a deep, unguarded sound that startled me with its strength. For once, I felt both the mother who had given so much and the woman who still had her own life to claim. When darkness deepened and stars began to prick the horizon, the lanterns swayed gently overhead, their light casting shifting patterns across the table. I looked around at the faces illuminated there, 18 souls who had shown up. Not because they had to, but because they wanted to. For the first time in a long while, I did not feel erased. I felt written back into my own story. The morning after the gathering, I woke with the sound of waves still echoing in my chest. My sketchbook, still open on the bedside table, bore faint smudges of salt air where I had pressed my notes too quickly. I thought the ceremony would live only in memory lantern light, on linen 18 voices rising above the surf. That was enough for me. But Isla had been busy. When I walked into the kitchen, she was already scrolling through her camera coffee cup, balanced precariously on her knee. "Look at this one," she said, turning the screen toward me. Lanterns glowing like fireflies. My hand resting gently on the tablecloth, guests leaning toward one another in easy laughter. The photograph seemed to hum with warmth. "I've posted a few," she admitted, grinning. "Don't worry, nothing overdone. Just images that capture the feeling. I thought maybe your students or friends would like to see." By evening, my phone buzzed with notifications. A Charleston wedding blog had picked up Isla's post, sharing it under the headline, "An Intimate Coastal Gathering That Redefines Celebration." The article praised the authenticity, the hand-lettered menus, the wildflower arrangements that felt more like love than spectacle. At first, I stared at the page in disbelief. My small, quiet evening, born from rejection, stitched together by kindness, was now displayed for strangers to admire. Comments trickled in, then grew into a flood. Words like genuine, soulful, refreshing repeated themselves. The next morning, I opened my email to find a message from a bride I had never met. "I saw your work on Charleston Weddings blog. Do you have availability this fall?" Another followed an hour later. And another. By mid-afternoon, my inbox had filled with inquiries. I spread the requests across the dining table, fingers trembling. Some asked for invitations, others for full event design. One florist even wrote, "I'd love to collaborate on future projects. Your eye for detail is stunning." For years, my work had been steady, but quiet passed through word of mouth. Now, within days, my calendar filled with possibility. I sat back in my chair, the edges of the table cool beneath my hands, and let the realization wash over me. What had been meant to diminish me had instead become a showcase. When Mateo stopped by that evening with a basket of fresh bread, I showed him the article. He read it silently, then looked up with a smile that carried no surprise. Of course it's spreading. People recognize truth when they see it. They're hungry for it. Later, as Isla dropped off a stack of prints from the evening, she set one aside in a frame. It was the photograph of me standing at the head of the table, lanterns glowing above my hands, pressed lightly on linen as I spoke. "You should keep this in your studio," she said softly. I lifted the frame, tracing the lines of my face. For so long I had been seen through other people's lenses, difficult, unstable, jealous. Now here I was, seen clearly without distortion. That night, I returned to my journal. Instead of cataloging slights, I listed new inquiries, names of brides, small business owners, even a corporate client asking about custom stationery. The pages that once carried shadows now held seeds of a new season. When I set the pen down, the condo felt different, lighter, alive with the hum of something larger than me. The lanterns might have been packed away, but their glow lingered, rippling outward, reaching places I had never imagined. It was a week after the blog feature on a damp Thursday evening when I heard the knock. Not sharp and insistent like Marlene's, not clipped like Lena's. This one was hesitant. 3 soft raps, a pause, then one more. When I opened the door, Nathan stood there alone, rain darkening his jacket at the shoulders. His eyes flicked past me into the condo, as though checking whether anyone else was inside. "Hi, Mom," he said quietly. I stepped aside, and he entered with the careful movements of a man stepping into uncertain territory. I hadn't seen him without Lena in months. He looked smaller somehow, without her presence to brace against. We sat in the living room, the lamplight soft against the walls. Nathan rubbed his palms against his knees the way he had as a boy before a difficult confession. I saw the photos, he began. His voice caught on the word, and he cleared his throat. "From your gathering. It looked beautiful. Everyone seemed happy." I nodded, waiting. He stared down at his hands. "I need you to understand something. I wasn't silent because I don't care. I was silent because I felt trapped. If I defended you, Lena would think I was choosing you over her. If I stayed quiet, you thought I was abandoning you. Either way, I lost." His words ached, but they also rang true. I thought of his sidelong glances, his half-formed sentences, the way his voice had faded when Lena stepped into the room. He hadn't been cruel. He had been afraid. "I didn't want to lose my wife," he said softly. "And I didn't want to lose my mother. So I tried to hold both, and I ended up wounding you." Rain tapped against the window. I folded my hands in my lap, searching for steadiness before I spoke. "Nathan," I said, my voice gentle but firm, "love doesn't mean erasing someone else. I don't need to be your wife's rival. But I will not accept being made invisible." His shoulders sagged. "I know. I see that now. I don't know how to fix it." I let the silence stretch, then leaned forward. "Respect, first. That's the price of a relationship with me. Respect when I walk into a room, when my name is spoken, when my presence is questioned. Without that, access is closed. With it, the door can stay open." He looked up, finally, his eyes shining, though whether with rain or tears I couldn't tell. "So there's still a chance." "There's always a chance," I said, "but I won't chase it. You'll have to meet me halfway." For the first time all evening, a faint smile ghosted across his face, fleeting but real. He nodded slowly, as though absorbing each word. He stood to leave, his movements reluctant. At the door, he turned back. "I don't expect you to forgive me quickly, but I hope you'll let me try again." I felt the ache in my chest soften just slightly. "The chain is on the door, Nathan, but it isn't locked. That's all I can offer right now." He nodded once more and stepped out into the rain, pulling his jacket close. I watched from the window as he walked down the street, shoulders hunched, swallowed by the night. The condo was quiet again, but it no longer felt hollow. His absence was heavy, yes, but it carried a thread of possibility, thin, fragile, but present. I touched the framed photograph from the seaside gathering, the lanterns glowing softly above my hand at the table. For now, that light was enough to hold me. The summer drifted into fall, and Charleston's air softened with the faint chill of change. By then, the noise around the wedding had faded, replaced by the ordinary chatter of other people's lives. Fiona and Lena's names no longer dominated the gossip that once found its way into my ears. The story had run its course, as all performances do. But my life, finally, was no longer tethered to theirs. One crisp morning, I sat on the porch of Matteo's villa at Folly Beach, with a mug of tea warming my hands. The horizon glowed pale gold, the tide rolling in slow and steady. Isla leaned against the railing with her camera capturing the light as it shifted, while Matteo moved quietly between us, arranging fresh bread and figs on a plate. We spoke in fragments, letting silences carry us. There was no rush to fill the air. The ocean did that for us. "Do you ever miss it?" Isla asked softly after a while. The idea of being part of their celebrations, I sipped my tea before answering. I miss what I thought it was, not what it really was. I see it clearly now. What they called love was obligation, and what they called respect was silence. I've let that go. Matteo set the plate on the table and joined us. "Sometimes we lose roles we thought defined us," he said gently, "but that only makes room for new ones." I thought of the months since the gathering, the inquiries that had poured into my inbox, the brides who sought my artistry, not out of pity, but admiration. I thought of the evenings spent lettering menus in warm lamplight, of Isla's laughter echoing through my condo of Matteo, teaching me how to prune roses along the villa's fence. The role of mother had not disappeared, but it had shifted, making space for teacher, artist, friend, woman. On my own balcony back in Charleston, the broken mug from that first day now hung as wind chimes. Matteo had helped me drill holes into the softened shards. Isla had threaded them with twine. When the wind swept through, the pieces clinked against each other in a sound delicate but unyielding proof that even brokenness could sing. Sometimes, when I heard the faint chime in the night, I remembered the silence that once pressed against me. The two could not coexist anymore. I had chosen the sound of fragments remade. Nathan had come by twice since that rainy evening. He never brought Lena, and he never stayed long. But he came. The first time he asked about my work. The second he brought me a potted orchid, awkward, in his hands. Our conversations were cautious, like children learning to wade back into the tide. I didn't know what the future would hold, but I knew the door was ajar. And that was enough. As the waves rose and fell that morning at Folly Beach, I felt no bitterness. Only gratitude for what had endured. The love of chosen family. The freedom of telling my own story. The dignity of no longer bowing my head to stay in someone else's picture. I turned to Isla and Matteo, their faces touched by the sun. "Love is the gift," I said quietly, "but respect is the receipt. Without both, the purchase fails." Neither spoke right away. Matteo reached for my hand. Isla lowered her camera, and for a long moment, we just sat in the steady sound of the surf. The tide carried the past out with it, scattering it across the horizon. I watched it go, and I did not chase it. If respect, not inheritance or invitation, were the only legacy you left, would your family treasure it or squander it like dust?